The moment was electric. Keith stood frozen, just steps from the living room, as laughter floated up to him. Lisa's familiar laugh, warm, full of life, now sent chills down his spine. And then came the voice of another man, deep and casual, responding to her. The sound of clinking glasses echoed like a cruel symphony. Keith's heart pounded like a war drum as he crept closer. The truth dawning painfully clear. Through the narrow crack in the doorway, he saw them. Lisa, flushed and radiant, leaning into Rick, her boss. The wine bottle between them told a story Keith could no longer deny. His world splintered in an instant, every piece crashing around him. But before diving deeper into this gut-wrenching tale, tell me, where are you watching this from? Share your location in the comments below. And if this story has you hooked, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications to never miss what happens next. The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting soft golden hues across the kitchen table. Keith sat at the head of the table, sipping his coffee and watching his kids, Maddie and Liam, bicker over the last slice of toast. It was a familiar scene, one that used to bring him immeasurable joy. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Daddy, tell Liam to stop hogging the butter," Maddie, his 7-year-old, pouted, clutching her plate protectively. Keith chuckled. "Liam, share with your sister. There's plenty for everyone." Liam, 2 years older and every bit the mischief maker, rolled his eyes dramatically. "She always gets what she wants," he muttered, but relented, sliding the butter knife her way. Keith should have been savoring these moments. The laughter, the banter, the chaotic mornings filled with love. And yet, a hollow ache nestled itself deep in his chest. The spark that once brightened their home felt dimmer lately, as if some invisible thread had begun to fray. His gaze drifted to the family photo on the mantel, taken just a year ago during a vacation to Florida. Lisa's radiant smile in the picture felt like a taunt now, a reminder of the connection they used to share. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought. They were just going through a rough patch. Every marriage had those, right? After breakfast, Keith walked the kids to the school bus. As the yellow vehicle pulled away, Maddie and Liam waving enthusiastically through the window, Keith felt a pang of sadness. It wasn't just them he felt he was losing. It was Lisa, too. There were smiles, Keith murmured to himself as he walked back to the house, but not the same spark. Something was missing, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. Keith sat at his desk at work, fingers tapping rhythmically against the keyboard, but his mind was elsewhere. His coworker Karen, a bubbly woman in her mid-40s, leaned over his cubicle wall. "You've been spacing out all morning," she teased. "What's on your mind, Casanova?" Keith grinned sheepishly. "Thinking about surprising Lisa. Things have been off lately. I thought maybe a romantic evening could bring us back to where we used to be." Karen's face lit up. "That's sweet. What's the plan?" Keith explained his idea. A candlelit dinner at home, just the two of them. He'd send the kids to their grandparents' house for the night, cook her favorite meal, and recreate the magic they once shared. Karen nodded approvingly. "You can't go wrong with wine, chocolate, and rosés," she said, winking. "Let me know if you need a hand picking anything out." By lunchtime, Keith had a list ready. After work, he visited the local florist, choosing deep red roses that reminded him of their wedding day. Next came a stop at the grocery store for Lisa's favorite Merlot and the rich dark chocolate she loved. Later, as he stood in the bedroom, carefully spreading rose petals across the bed in the shape of a heart, Keith felt a flicker of hope. The soft petals felt cool against his hands, and the faint scent of roses filled the air. He imagined Lisa walking in, her face lighting up, the tension between them melting away. "Grandma's house again?" Maddie exclaimed when he told the kids about their sleepover plans. Her wide eyes held a mix of excitement and suspicion. "Yes," Keith replied, smiling. "And you'll have ice cream before dinner if I know her." Liam, already packing his favorite toy car, grinned. "Grandma's house is awesome. Can we go now?" Keith laughed, ruffling his son's hair. "Not yet, Bunny. Tomorrow night." For the first time in weeks, Keith felt a sense of anticipation instead of dread. Maybe this was what they needed, a moment to remember why they chose each other, why they fell in love. He hoped, desperately, that it would be enough. Keith's excitement carried him through the day, but as the romantic evening loomed closer, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was just out of reach, lurking in the shadows. What he didn't know was that everything he believed about his life, his marriage, and his love for Lisa was about to be turned upside down. Keith took one last look around the bedroom. The rose petals were perfectly arranged on the bed, the wine glasses sat sparkling on the nightstand, and the soft glow of the bedside lamp bathed the room in a golden hue. He smiled to himself, imagining the look on Lisa's face when she walked in. For the first time in weeks, he felt optimistic. The front door opened downstairs. Lisa was home. Keith's pulse quickened, and he straightened his shirt, ready to greet her with open arms, but as he stepped toward the staircase, he froze. Laughter echoed from below. Her laughter. It was warm and familiar, a sound that used to fill their home with joy. But then came something else, something unexpected. A man's voice, deep and casual, responding to her. Keith stood still at the top of the stairs. His initial confusion quickly morphed into unease. His brows furrowed as he tried to make sense of what he was hearing. Why would Lisa bring someone home unannounced? Who could it be? The laughter grew louder, followed by the clink of glasses. Keith's chest tightened. Slowly, he descended the first few steps, his socked feet silent against the wood. The voices were clearer now, their words indistinct, but their tone unmistakably playful. Laughter. Her laughter. But whose voice was that? The thought thudded in his mind like a drumbeat. Keith gripped the banister, his knuckles whitening. The warmth he'd felt earlier was replaced by a cold, creeping dread. He leaned against the wall near the bottom of the staircase, craning his neck to peer into the living room. His heart was pounding so hard it felt as if the sound might give him away. The voices drifted from just beyond his view. Lisa's tone was light, teasing, as if she didn't have a care in the world. Then came the man's voice again, smooth and confident. Keith couldn't make out the words, but the intimacy in the exchange was undeniable. His stomach churned. He wanted to call out, to confront whoever was with her, but something held him back, as if hearing the truth would be worse than not knowing. A bead of sweat slid down his temple. His palms were damp, his breathing shallow. Keith's mind raced. Who was he? A coworker? A friend? He tried to recall if Lisa had mentioned anyone stopping by, but nothing came to mind. The thought of her with another man seemed impossible. Absurd, even. They'd had their struggles lately, but this? No, this wasn't Lisa. The sound of footsteps moving closer jolted him from his thoughts. He stepped back, pressing himself into the shadows near the staircase. He watched as Lisa emerged into view, her cheeks flushed, a smile tugging at her lips. The man followed, carrying what looked like an expensive bottle of wine. Keith's world began to crack. He stared at the two of them, frozen, his mind unable to process what his eyes were seeing. Lisa leaned into the man as she laughed again, her hand brushing his arm. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. My palms were damp, heart pounding in my chest like a war drum, he thought, as the weight of betrayal settled on his shoulders. Keith retreated silently up the stairs, his body trembling. He needed to think, to process. He sat on the edge of their bed, staring at the rose petals he had carefully placed just moments ago. The contrast between the scene he had planned and the reality downstairs was too much to bear. A lump rose in his throat, but he swallowed it down. He couldn't afford to lose control, not yet. As Lisa's laughter floated up from below, it felt like shards of glass cutting through him. The romantic evening he had imagined was already in ruins, and the cracks in his world were widening by the second. Keith's hands trembled as he stood at the edge of their bedroom door. The voices downstairs had quieted, and he hadn't heard Lisa or the man leave. A terrible suspicion gnawed at his mind, growing stronger with every passing second. He turned the doorknob slowly, pushing the door open just enough to step inside. The room smelled faintly of roses, a cruel reminder of the effort he'd poured into the evening. Then he saw them. Lisa stood near the bed, her blouse slightly disheveled, her hair falling out of its usual neat bun. And next to her was Rick, her boss. His tie hung loosely around his neck, and his hand was resting on the small of Lisa's back. For a moment, they didn't notice Keith, who was frozen in place, staring at the scene like it was some grotesque nightmare. But then Lisa looked up, her face paled instantly. "Keith," she gasped, stepping back. The sound of her voice was all it took. Fury surged through Keith like a wildfire. He stepped forward, his vision narrowing, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. "What the hell is this?" he growled, his voice low and trembling. "Keith, it's not what it looks like," Lisa stammered, holding her hands up as if to shield herself from the storm she knew was coming. Rick, ever the polished corporate type, tried to interject, smoothing his tie. "Look, Keith, let's just talk about this." "Talk?" Keith barked, cutting him off. The word was a trigger, releasing the torrent of rage he'd been trying to contain. His fist connected with Rick's face before another word could leave his mouth. The impact was brutal. Rick staggered backward, blood spurting from his nose as he clutched his face in shock. "You son of a bitch!" Keith roared, advancing on him again. "Keith, stop!" Lisa screamed, grabbing his arm in a futile attempt to hold him back. But Keith shook her off, his eyes locked on Rick, who was now stumbling toward the wall trying to steady himself. "You come into my house?" Keith spat, his voice trembling with fury. "You touch my wife?" He stepped closer, his chest heaving, every muscle in his body tense. Rick held up a hand, his other still pressed to his bloodied face. I didn't mean for this to happen," he began, his voice muffled and panicked. Keith didn't let him finish. "Shut up," he roared, his voice breaking with raw emotion. "You don't get to explain." Lisa tried again, her voice cracking. "Keith, please, listen to me. I can explain." He turned on her, his eyes blazing. "Explain?" he snarled. "What is there to explain, Lisa? What the hell is this?" His voice cracked, the hurt and betrayal seeping through his anger. Lisa's eyes filled with tears, her hands shaking as she reached for him. "It's not what you think." "Don't," Keith snapped, stepping back as if her touch would burn him. "Don't you dare try to spin this." Rick, still hunched over and wiping blood from his face with his sleeve, tried to edge toward the door. Keith noticed and cut him off, pointing a finger at him. "Don't even think about it," he warned. "I'm leaving," Rick muttered, his voice unsteady. "I don't want any more trouble." "Too late for that," Keith shot back, his voice dripping with venom. As Rick fumbled for the door, Lisa grabbed Keith's arm again, her voice breaking. "Please, Keith, just listen. It's not that simple." Keith yanked his arm away, his chest rising and falling as he struggled to catch his breath. His world had already shattered, and now it felt like shards of it were piercing every inch of him. He turned back to Lisa, his voice low and trembling. "You have until I get back to pack your things. I don't want to see you here when I return." "Keith, wait," she started, but the sound of the door slamming behind him cut her off. Keith slammed the front door behind him, the sound reverberating through the quiet neighborhood. His breath came in ragged bursts as he stormed down the walkway to his car. His hands fumbled for the keys, shaking with adrenaline and fury. He climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "How did we get here?" he muttered under his breath, staring blankly at the dashboard. 12 years, 2 kids, gone, in a single moment. The image of Lisa standing there, disheveled and stammering excuses, was burned into his mind, and Rick, the smug bastard, trying to smooth things over as though this was just some business deal gone wrong. Keith shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. With a sharp twist of the ignition, the engine roared to life, breaking the silence. He pulled out of the driveway, tires screeching against the pavement as he sped off. He didn't know where he was going, he just needed to leave, to escape the suffocating weight of betrayal that clung to him like a second skin. The streets blurred as he drove aimlessly through town. Traffic lights changed, storefronts passed, but he barely noticed. His thoughts spiraled, a chaotic tangle of anger, pain, and disbelief. Was it always there, right in front of me? How long has this been going on? And what the hell do I do now? His grip on the wheel tightened. He thought of Maddie and Liam, the way they'd waved at him from the school bus that morning. The betrayal wasn't just about him. It was about them too. The foundation of their family, the life they'd built together, was crumbling beneath his feet. Eventually, Keith found himself pulling into the parking lot of a dimly lit bar on the edge of town. The neon sign flickered above the entrance, casting eerie shadows across the gravel. He killed the engine and sat there for a moment, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, his jaw clenched tight. Inside, the bar was nearly empty, the faint hum of a jukebox filling the silence. Keith slid onto a stool and ordered a whiskey. The bartender, a burly man with a kind face, nodded without a word, setting the glass down in front of him. Keith downed it in one gulp, the burn in his throat a welcome distraction from the storm raging inside him. As he stared at the empty glass, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it at first, but when it buzzed again and again, he finally pulled it out. Lisa's name lit up the screen. His thumb hovered over the decline button, but something compelled him to open the messages instead. The words on the screen made his stomach churn. "Keith, please, I need to explain. Rick manipulated me. It wasn't what you think." Keith read the messages again, his heart pounding. Manipulated? His first instinct was to dismiss it as another excuse, another lie to soften the blow of her betrayal. But a small part of him hesitated. Could it be true? He set the phone down on the bar, staring at the screen as if it might hold all the answers. His mind raced with questions, but one thought rose above the rest. Do I even want to hear her explanation? The bartender approached, raising an eyebrow. Another? Keith nodded, sliding the glass forward. As the amber liquid filled the glass, Keith let out a deep breath. He wasn't ready to go back. Not yet. Whatever Lisa had to say would have to wait. For now, all he could do was sit there, drowning the ache in whiskey and hoping the next drink would dull the pain just a little more. Keith's phone buzzed incessantly on the nightstand, a steady hum that grated against the silence of his small motel room. He had checked into the place hours ago, too numb and furious to even think about going home. The weight of the evening pressed down on him, and though he had barely touched the stiff mattress, he couldn't bring himself to lie down. The screen lit up again. Lisa's name. The call ended, but moments later, a notification popped up. Another voicemail. Keith let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head as he picked up the phone and stared at the growing list of missed calls and messages. She doesn't quit, does she? Dropping the phone back onto the table, he leaned back in the chair, running his hands over his face. The faint scent of whiskey still clung to him from earlier, but it hadn't done much to dull the anger simmering beneath the surface. Finally, unable to ignore the nagging buzz of curiosity, Keith picked up the phone again. His thumb hovered over the voicemail icon. He didn't want to hear her excuses, didn't want to hear her beg, but still, something deep inside him, whether it was stubborn hope or the need for answers, compelled him to press play. The first few messages were predictable. Lisa's voice was shaky, laced with panic, as she pleaded for him to call her back. "Keith, please, I know you're angry, but just talk to me. Let me explain. It's not what you think." Ugh. He deleted it without hesitation. The second one was more desperate. "Keith, I'm so sorry. I don't even know where to start. Please don't give up on us. Don't give up on our family." The words hit a nerve, but he clenched his jaw and deleted that one too. When he reached the third message, something in Lisa's tone stopped him cold. There was no pleading, no frantic apologies. Instead, her voice was low and trembling, a mix of fear and something else he couldn't place. "Keith?" "It wasn't what it looked like. I swear to you, it wasn't. Rick, he threatened me. He said if I didn't..." Her voice broke, and there was a long pause before she continued. "I didn't know what else to do. Please, believe me." Keith's grip on the phone tightened as the message ended. For a moment, he just sat there, staring at the screen, his mind racing. Threatened. He wanted to dismiss it as another lie, another desperate attempt to absolve herself. But there was something in her voice, something raw, something almost truthful. It gnawed at the edges of his certainty, pulling him into an uneasy limbo between disbelief and doubt. "We now," he muttered to himself, his voice low and bitter. "Why tell me this now?" He replayed the message, his jaw tightening with each word. If she was lying, it was cruel even by her standards. But if she was telling the truth, he shook his head, refusing to entertain the possibility. No, she made her choice. She let him into our home. She let this happen. But the words clung to him, like a splinter he couldn't pull out. He thought back to Rick's smug expression, the way he'd brushed off Keith's fury like it was nothing. There had been a confidence to him, an air of control that had made Keith's skin crawl. Setting the phone down, Keith leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he stared at the floor. Lisa's words looped in his head, growing louder with each repetition. "Rick threatened me." He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. If there was even a shred of truth to her claim, it meant everything he thought he knew about the situation was more complicated than he'd imagined. The cynic in him told him to ignore it, to let her drown in her own guilt. But that faint flicker of hope, the same hope that had driven him to plan their romantic evening, refused to die completely. Keith closed his eyes, breathing deeply to steady the whirlwind of emotions threatening to consume him. Whatever the truth was, one thing was certain. This wasn't over. Not yet. Keith sat in the small, stark office, his foot tapping against the polished floor. Across from him, the divorce lawyer, a sharp-eyed man in his early 50s named Gerald, adjusted his glasses and leaned forward, scanning a file. The faint hum of a desk fan filled the silence as Keith waited, his patience thinning by the second. "So," Gerald began, closing the file and folding his hands on the desk, "you want a divorce? Let's start with the basics. What's the living situation?" Keith sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "We own the house together, joint mortgage, but after what happened, I told her to leave. I can't have her there, not after—" He paused, his jaw tightening as the image of Lisa and Rick flashed in his mind. "Not after what she did." Gerald nodded, his expression neutral but firm. "Keith, I understand you're angry, but legally you can't just kick her out. It's her house too." Keith's foot stopped tapping. "What do you mean I can't kick her out? She's the one who cheated. She brought him into my home." His voice rose, but Gerald raised a hand to calm him. "I get it. Believe me, I do. But the law doesn't care about moral high ground, Keith. It cares about equity. Unless you can prove danger or something egregious, she has as much right to stay there as you do." Keith slumped back in his chair, his frustration boiling over. "So what am I supposed to do? Just live with her like nothing happened?" "No, you don't have to live with her," Gerald said calmly. "But you can't force her to leave either. What you can do is make this as uncomfortable for her as possible. Legally, of course." Keith frowned. "What does that even mean?" Gerald adjusted his glasses again, leaning forward. "Leverage. You need leverage. And this affair of hers? It's a gift." Keith's eyebrows shot up. "How is any of this a gift?" Gerald tapped his pen against the desk. "She had an affair with her boss, right? That means workplace misconduct. If you can prove it, you can hit him, and possibly her, with legal consequences. Companies don't like scandals like this. It could cost him his job, and her a lot of credibility. That, Keith, is leverage." The thought of Rick losing everything brought a flicker of satisfaction to Keith's otherwise grim mood. "How do I prove it?" he asked. Gerald smirked slightly. "You don't have to prove it outright, not yet. Start by gathering evidence. Emails, texts, anything that shows this wasn't just a one-time thing. If their company has a code of conduct or a morality clause, this could be your ticket to making their lives miserable." Keith's mind raced. He thought of Lisa's phone, her frantic messages, her desperate attempts to explain. Maybe there was something there, something he could use. "And what about the kids?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Gerald's expression softened, but his tone remained firm. Custody is a separate battle. Unless there's evidence that she's unfit as a parent, it's likely to be joint. But if her affair negatively impacts them, emotionally or otherwise, that could tip things in your favor. Keith rubbed his hands together, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. So, what you're saying is this isn't just about her cheating, it's about how I play my cards. Exactly, Gerald said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. You're hurt, and that's understandable. But divorce isn't just emotional, it's strategic. You need to think a few steps ahead. Focus on the big picture, your kids, your assets, your future. Use what she did to give yourself an advantage. Keith nodded slowly, the fire in his chest reigniting. For the first time since everything fell apart, he felt a sense of direction. It wasn't much, but it was enough to hold on to. As he left the office, Gerald's words echoed in his mind. You can't kick her out. It's legally her house too, but you can make her regret it. And for the first time, Keith knew exactly what he had to do. Keith pushed open the glass doors of the office building with a force that startled the receptionist. Her polite smile faltered as she glanced up at him, her eyes widening slightly. Keith didn't stop to explain. His footsteps echoed through the sleek lobby, his destination clear. Sir, do you have an appointment? The receptionist called after him, her voice laced with confusion. Keith didn't respond. He jabbed the elevator button, his jaw tight and his fists clenched at his sides. The polished floors and muted hum of the building only fueled his anger. He wasn't here to talk. He was here to settle things. Managed by a code, the elevator moved to retrieve Keith's clothing from a closet at the summit box. When the elevator doors opened on the 10th floor, he stepped out and spotted Rick's office immediately. The nameplate on the door might as well have been a bullseye. Without knocking, Keith shoved the door open. Rick looked up from his desk, startled, but only for a moment. His surprise quickly melted into a smug smile, the kind that made Keith's blood boil. Keith, Rick said smoothly, leaning back in his chair, I wasn't expecting you. Keith stepped inside, slamming the door shut behind him. I bet you weren't, he growled. His voice was low but laced with venom. We need to talk. Rick raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor infuriatingly intact. Is this about Lisa? He asked, feigning ignorance. Because I'm not sure this is the place. Keith cut him off, his voice rising. You think this is funny? Coming into my home, my life, and tearing it apart? You think you can just get away with it? Rick didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. Keith, he said, his tone condescending, I understand you're upset, but maybe you should take this up with Lisa. She's the one. Don't you dare, Keith snapped, slamming his hands on the desk. The loud crack echoed through the room. Don't you dare act like you're innocent in all this. Rick's smug smile widened. Innocent? No, but let's not pretend I forced her into anything. She's a grown woman, Keith. She made her choices. Keith's fists clenched so tightly his nails dug into his palms. Stay away from her, he said through gritted teeth. If I see you near her or my family again, I'll make sure you regret it. Rick leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms casually. That's quite the threat, he said, his tone almost amused. But let me ask you something, Keith. Do you really think this is the first time? Keith froze, his breath catching in his throat. What the hell are you talking about? Rick's expression didn't waver. Ask her, he said simply. Ask Lisa how many times this has happened before. You might be surprised. The words hit Keith like a punch to the gut. For a moment, the air seemed to leave the room. His mind raced, filled with questions he didn't want to ask but couldn't ignore. Seeing the crack in Keith's anger, Rick continued, his voice dripping with calculated calm. You think you know her, but maybe you don't. Maybe this little incident isn't as unique as you'd like to believe. Keith took a step back, his chest heaving as he tried to process Rick's words. His anger burned hotter now, not just at Rick, but at the possibility that he might be telling the truth. Stay away, Keith repeated, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and uncertainty. Or I swear this won't end well for you. Rick shrugged, the smirk never leaving his face. "Whatever you say, Keith." Without another word, Keith turned and stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind him. His mind was spinning, Rick's words echoing over and over. "Ask her how many times this has happened before." As Keith stepped back into the elevator, his reflection in the polished walls looked like a man on the edge. He gritted his teeth, a single thought consuming him. Had he been blind all along? After the election came the selection of candidates and rumors, and whoever made the call to be president would be called upon. Keith sat stiffly in the living room, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the empty coffee table in front of him. The room was quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Lisa stood a few feet away, wringing her hands, her eyes red and puffy from crying. "Just say it," Keith muttered, his voice low and cold. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. Lisa took a shaky breath. "Keith, Her voice broke, and she wiped her eyes. "I need you to understand." "Understand?" Keith snapped, his head jerking up to meet her gaze. His eyes were sharp, piercing. "What exactly am I supposed to understand, Lisa? That you cheated? That you let him into our house? That this," he gestured vaguely, his voice rising, "was some kind of mistake?" Lisa flinched, but forced herself to stand her ground. "It wasn't just once," she said quietly, the words barely audible. Keith froze, his body stiffening as the air seemed to leave the room. He blinked, his mind struggling to process what he'd just heard. "What?" he said, his voice almost a whisper. Lisa clasped her hands together, her shoulders shaking. "It wasn't just once," she repeated, her voice trembling. "It started months ago. I don't know how it got this far, but I swear I didn't mean for it." "Stop," Keith interrupted, standing abruptly. The chair scraped loudly against the floor and Lisa jumped. "You didn't mean for it to happen," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "How the hell does that make any sense, Lisa? You're saying this wasn't a mistake, it was a choice, a repeated, deliberate choice." Tears streamed down Lisa's face as she reached for him. "Keith, please, just listen." "No!" he shouted, stepping back out of her reach. His chest heaved, his fists clenched at his sides. "You don't get to cry and beg me to listen. Not after this." Lisa's sobs filled the room, but Keith's fury didn't waver. He turned away, running his hands through his hair, trying to contain the storm brewing inside him. He wanted to scream, to punch something, anything, to release the unbearable weight pressing down on him. "I've given you everything," he said, his voice quieter now but no less intense. "Everything, Lisa. Our life, our family, and this is what I get in return?" "I know I've hurt you," Lisa said, her voice breaking. "I know I've made mistakes, but Keith, there's something else I need to tell you." Keith turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. "What could you possibly say now that would make any of this better?" Lisa hesitated, her hands trembling as she wiped at her cheeks. "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Keith stared at her, his expression blank, as though his brain couldn't process what she'd just said. "What?" he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm pregnant," Lisa repeated, her voice desperate. "And it's yours, Keith. I know it's yours." Keith let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You expect me to believe that? After everything you've done? After everything you just admitted? You want me to trust you on this?" "I'm telling you the truth," Lisa pleaded, stepping closer. "You're the father." "I know it." Keith took a step back, his hands raised as if to ward her off. "You've lied to me about everything else, Lisa. Why should I believe you now?" "Because I'm not lying about this," she cried. "Keith, I swear to you, it's yours. Please. You have to believe me." Keith stared at her, his emotions warring within him. Disbelief, rage, and a flicker of doubt collided, leaving him feeling hollow and lost. He wanted to scream at her, to demand answers, but all he could do was stand there, staring at the woman he thought he knew, wondering how his life had unraveled so completely. Finally, he turned away, his voice cold and distant. "I need time," he said, walking toward the door. "Don't follow me." End of chapter. Lisa's sobs echoed behind him as the door slammed shut, leaving her alone in the ruins of their shattered marriage. The conference room was cold and sterile, its air heavy with tension. Keith sat at one end of the long table, his lawyer Gerald beside him. Across from them sat Rick, flanked by two attorneys who exuded the confidence of people used to cleaning up messes. Rick avoided Keith's glare, his demeanor less smug than usual, but still irritatingly composed. The lead attorney on Rick's side opened the discussion, her voice calm and measured. "We understand the allegations against Mr. Daniels and wish to resolve this matter quickly and amicably. Our client is willing to offer a settlement to avoid prolonged legal proceedings." Keith leaned forward, his jaw tightening. "A settlement," he said, his tone sharp. "You think money fixes this?" Gerald placed a steadying hand on Keith's arm, cutting in before he could say more. "Let's hear the terms," Gerald said coolly, his eyes fixed on the opposing lawyer. She nodded, flipping through her papers. "We propose a settlement of $100,000. This amount compensates for any perceived damages while allowing all parties to move forward." Keith let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. $100,000? That's insulting." Rick finally spoke, his tone clipped. "Keith, this is about putting everything behind us. Dragging this out in court isn't going to help anyone." Keith's fists clenched, but Gerald's calm voice cut through the rising tension. "I think we both know that figure isn't going to work. Given the workplace policies your client violated and the reputational damage this could cause, we're looking at a significantly higher number." The opposing lawyer's expression hardened. "And what number are you suggesting?" $300,000, Gerald said without missing a beat. His tone was firm, as though the amount was non-negotiable. Rick's face darkened. $300,000? He repeated, his voice rising. "That's ridiculous." "It's appropriate," Gerald replied smoothly. "Your client engaged in a workplace relationship with a subordinate, violating the company's code of conduct. If this goes public, the company could face scrutiny, and Mr. Daniels's career would suffer irreparable harm." The lawyers on Rick's side exchanged glances, their confidence faltering. The lead attorney cleared her throat. "That's a significant increase. We would need assurances that no further legal action or public statements would be made about this matter." Keith's glare burned into Rick. "I don't want your money," he said through gritted teeth. "I want you gone, out of my life, out of this state. I never want to see your face again." Rick's lawyer hesitated, then nodded. "Mr. Daniels has already been offered a transfer opportunity. We can include his relocation in the agreement, provided the settlement terms are finalized." Keith's eyes narrowed. "How soon?" "Within the next 2 weeks," she replied. Gerald leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but triumphant. "Then we're in agreement. $300,000 and Mr. Daniels' immediate transfer to another state. We'll have the paperwork drawn up." Rick's face was flushed with anger, but he said nothing, his jaw tight, as his lawyer nodded. "We'll review the documents and ensure they're signed promptly." The meeting ended with curt nods and exchanged documents, the tension in the room slowly dissipating as Rick and his team exited. Keith remained seated for a moment, staring at the empty chair Rick had vacated. "You got what you wanted," Gerald said, packing up his briefcase. "It's not justice, but it's the closest thing to it." Keith exhaled deeply, the weight of the negotiation lifting slightly. "It's a start," he muttered, standing and following Gerald out of the room. Though the settlement wouldn't fix everything, knowing Rick would be gone for good felt like a small but necessary victory. Keith was sitting on the back porch, a beer in hand, staring out at the yard where Maddie and Liam once played. The crisp evening air carried the faint scent of autumn leaves, but the usual comfort it brought was absent. His mind churned, tangled in the chaos Lisa had unleashed. He barely registered the sound of the back door opening until Lisa's hesitant footsteps approached. "Keith," her voice was soft, trembling, "can we talk?" He didn't turn to look at her. Instead, he took another swig of his beer, the silence between them stretching uncomfortably. "I'm sorry," Lisa began, her words thick with emotion. "I know that's not enough. I know I've hurt you, betrayed you in ways I can't even fathom. But I need you to know I still love you." Keith let out a hollow laugh, finally glancing her way. "Love me?" he said, his voice sharp. "You have a funny way of showing it, Lisa." She winced, tears glistening in her eyes. "I made mistakes," she admitted. "Terrible ones. But I swear, Keith, it wasn't what you think. Rick, he manipulated me. He pressured me. I wasn't in my right mind." Keith turned fully now, his expression cold. "You expect me to believe that? After months of lying, you want me to just take your word for it?" "I'll take a polygraph," Lisa said suddenly, her voice rising with desperation. "I'll do whatever it takes to prove I'm telling the truth. Please, Keith, I'll do anything to fix this." Her plea hung in the air, and for a moment Keith stared at her, his emotions warring within him. Part of him wanted to dismiss her outright, to reject the idea that anything could be salvaged. But another part, a quieter, more uncertain part, wondered if he owed it to their years together, to their kids, to at least hear her out. "You really think a polygraph is going to change anything?" he finally asked, his tone skeptical. "If it proves I'm telling the truth, maybe it'll help you believe me," Lisa replied. "I'll take it, Keith. Just give me a chance." The polygraph session was held in a sterile office, the kind of place that felt devoid of emotion despite the weight of the situation. Lisa sat across from the examiner, wires attached to her wrists and chest. Keith watched from the corner, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The examiner asked the questions, his voice steady and professional. "Did you willingly pursue a relationship with Rick Daniels?" "No," Lisa replied, her voice steady. "Did you continue the relationship out of love or romantic interest?" "No," she said again, a flicker of tension in her voice. "Do you believe the child you are carrying is Keith's?" "Yes," she said firmly. Keith's eyes narrowed as the examiner glanced at the machine, reading the results. After a pause, the examiner nodded. "She's being truthful." Lisa let out a shaky breath, relief washing over her face. She turned to Keith, her eyes filled with hope. "I told you," she said softly. "I told you I wasn't lying." But Keith's expression didn't change. He leaned back in his chair, his arms still crossed, his eyes cold. "So, you didn't love him, you didn't pursue it, but you still let it happen," he said, his voice laced with bitterness. "You let it happen, over and over, and now you want me to forgive you? Because a machine says you're not lying?" Lisa's hope faltered. "Keith, I didn't know how to stop it. I was scared, confused. I never stopped loving you." Keith shook his head, standing abruptly. "Love isn't enough, Lisa, not anymore." He walked out of the office, leaving her sitting there, tears streaming down her face. No matter what the polygraph said, the damage was already done, and some wounds couldn't be healed. The house was quieter now, but not in the way Keith had once feared. It was the kind of quiet filled with the soft hum of life, the steady rhythm of a new routine. Keith stood in the kitchen, flipping pancakes while Maddie sat at the table coloring, her brow furrowed in concentration. Liam was on the couch, watching cartoons, his laughter occasionally breaking the silence. "Dad, can I have chocolate chips in mine?" Maddie asked, glancing up with a hopeful smile. Keith chuckled, reaching for the bag of chips on the counter. "Of course. Chocolate chips for my little artist." Her face lit up, and Keith felt a small warmth bloom in his chest. Moments like these reminded him why he was fighting so hard to rebuild, to create a safe, happy space for them despite the chaos of the past few months. Sarah breathed a sigh of relief. When the pancakes were ready, Keith set the plates down in front of the kids. "Eat up. We've got a busy day ahead." "What are we doing today?" Liam asked between bites, syrup already smeared across his cheek. Keith leaned against the counter, crossing his arms with a smile. "Soccer practice for you, and Maddie has her art class. After that, I was thinking we could hit the park and maybe grab some ice cream." "And we get the kind with sprinkles?" Maddie chimed in. "Sprinkles are non-negotiable," Keith replied, earning a giggle from her. It wasn't easy, this new normal. Every decision felt weighted, every moment a balancing act between holding it together and making sure the kids didn't feel the cracks in the foundation. But Keith had made a promise to himself. No matter how much his world had fallen apart, Maddie and Liam would always come first. Later that afternoon, Keith sat on the sidelines of Liam's soccer practice, cheering as his son raced down the field. He felt a sense of pride watching Liam give his all, his determination evident in every stride. Maddie sat beside him, sketching the scene with her little pad of paper, her tongue poking out in concentration. "You're getting really good at that," Keith said, leaning over to look at her work. She grinned. "Thanks, Dad. I'm drawing Liam scoring a goal." Keith ruffled her hair. "Well, you'd better draw fast. I think he's about to." Sure enough, Liam kicked the ball into the net moments later, turning to flash a triumphant smile toward the sidelines. Keith clapped loudly, shouting his praise. These were the moments that kept him grounded, reminding him that life, while messy and unpredictable, still had its bright spots. As the day wound down, Keith found himself tucking the kids into bed, a ritual that had become his favorite part of the day. Maddie hugged her stuffed bunny tightly as he kissed her forehead. "Good night, sweetheart," he said softly. "Good night, Dad," she murmured, her eyes already closing. In Liam's room, Keith sat on the edge of the bed, listening as his son recounted the highlights of his practice. "Did you see my goal? It was awesome!" Keith smiled, nodding. It was more than awesome. It was unstoppable. Liam beamed before yawning, his energy finally waning. Keith leaned down to ruffle his hair. "Sleep tight, buddy. You've got another game to win tomorrow." As he closed their doors and headed back to the quiet of the living room, Keith felt a deep sense of purpose. The chaos of his past still lingered, but here, in the small victories and steady routines, he found peace. This new normal wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that was enough for now. The evening was calm, the kind of stillness that allowed Keith to think more clearly than he had in months. He sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in front of him, papers spread across the surface. Legal agreements, schedules, and plans for the kids filled the pages. This wasn't the life he had imagined, but it was the one he had now. He exhaled slowly, picking up the pen. Lisa's request for a meeting earlier that week had been civil but tense. She'd pleaded for another chance at reconciliation, but Keith had been firm. They were done. Still, their children were their shared responsibility, and Keith knew it was time to lay the groundwork for a stable co-parenting arrangement. He signed the last document, setting the pen down with a sense of finality. The custody schedule ensured both Maddie and Liam would have time with their mother without disrupting their routines. It wasn't ideal, but it was fair, and above all, it was for the kids. The sound of a knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Keith frowned, glancing at the clock. It was late for visitors. He stood and opened the door to find Cheryl standing there, holding a small bag of groceries. "Thought you could use some company," she said, with a warm smile. Keith stepped aside, letting her in. Cheryl had been a quiet presence in his life since the chaos began, always supportive but never overstepping. Over time, her steady kindness had become something more, though neither of them had said it out loud yet. "Thanks," he said, gesturing toward the kitchen. "I just finished up some paperwork." As Cheryl unpacked the bag, she glanced at him. "Custody stuff?" Keith nodded, leaning against the counter. "Yeah, it's all settled now. Lisa and I are going to co-parent. It's the best thing for the kids." Cheryl paused, her expression thoughtful. "And for you? Are you okay with that?" Keith looked down, his fingers drumming lightly on the counter. "It's not easy, but I've made peace with it. I have to focus on the future, for them, and for me." His voice softened as he added, "and maybe for us." Cheryl's cheeks flushed slightly, but her smile widened. "I'd like that," she said quietly. The moment between them was interrupted by the sound of Keith's phone buzzing on the counter. He frowned, picking it up. The caller was unknown, but the message notification that followed caught his attention. "It's a letter," he said aloud, opening the message. His eyes scanned the screen, his expression darkening with every line. The sender was Rick. "Keith," the letter began, "you probably don't want to hear from me, but I think you deserve to know the truth. Lisa wasn't as innocent in all of this as she's led you to believe. Keith's grip tightened on the phone as he read on. Rick detailed how their affair had started, not as manipulation, but as a calculated move by Lisa to gain leverage at work. She had approached Rick first, using their relationship to secure promotions and influence. The affair had only escalated when Rick threatened to expose her, forcing her to maintain the facade. By the time Keith finished reading, his hand was trembling. Cheryl stepped closer, her voice gentle. "Keith, what is it?" He handed her the phone without a word, his jaw tightening as she read. Cheryl's face fell, her brow furrowing in disbelief. She used him?" she murmured, her voice laced with shock. Keith turned away, his mind reeling. The betrayal, already a jagged wound, now felt even deeper. Everything Lisa had said, every tear she'd cried, was called into question. The woman he had once loved seemed like a stranger capable of manipulation he hadn't thought possible. He took a deep breath, grounding himself. The anger and hurt threatened to overwhelm him, but he reminded himself of what mattered most: Maddie and Liam. They were his anchor, his reason for staying steady in the face of the storm. "I'm done," he said finally, his voice firm. "I'll co-parent with her because I have to. But that's it. No more chances. No more lies." Cheryl placed a comforting hand on his arm. "You're doing the right thing, Keith. For you and for the kids." Keith nodded, his gaze steady now. Despite the fresh wave of betrayal, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: closure. The past was behind him, and though it was a painful chapter, he knew the future was still his to shape. And this time, he wouldn't let anyone take it from him. The quiet of the evening wrapped around Keith as he sat on the back porch, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands. The yard stretched out before him, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Keith felt a semblance of peace. He stared at the horizon, his thoughts drifting to the chaos of the past few months. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the lies. It had all felt like too much to bear. Yet, here he was, still standing. He had survived. Not unscathed, but stronger, in ways he hadn't expected. Keith's mind wandered to Lisa, the woman he had loved for over a decade, the mother of his children, the one he had trusted implicitly. He couldn't deny the anger that still simmered beneath the surface, but alongside it was something unexpected: clarity. "I loved her," he whispered to himself, "and maybe a part of me always will. But love isn't enough when trust is gone." He exits. The truth had been the hardest pill to swallow. Lisa's betrayal hadn't just been about the affair. It was the calculated decisions, the manipulation, the way she had allowed their family to crumble. Yet, Keith had made a choice, not for her, but for their children. Co-parenting wasn't forgiveness, but it was a step toward stability. Maddie and Liam deserved that, and he would give it to them, no matter how difficult it was. He took a sip of his coffee, the warmth grounding him. His thoughts shifted to Cheryl. She had entered his life quietly, offering support when he hadn't even realized he needed it. Her patience, her understanding, her unwavering kindness, they had been a balm to his wounded heart. For the first time in years, he felt the possibility of happiness, of love, untainted by lies. But even as he considered the future, Keith knew the scars would remain. They were a part of him now, a testament to the pain he had endured. Still, those scars didn't define him. If anything, they reminded him of his resilience. He had weathered the storm, and while he hadn't emerged unbroken, he had found a new sense of purpose. He looked down at his hands, rough and calloused from years of work. These hands had built a home, carried his children, and held the weight of his family's dreams. And now, they would rebuild. Not the life he had before, but something new, something stronger. Keith's gaze turned to the house. Inside, Maddie and Liam were likely asleep, their dreams untroubled by the struggles he had shielded them from. They were his greatest source of strength, his constant reminder of what truly mattered. "I'm still here," he said softly, as if reassuring himself, "I'm still standing." The breeze picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of laughter from a distant house. Keith smiled faintly, the sound stirring something within him. Life moved forward, no matter how heavy the burdens of the past. And as the sun dipped lower, casting a golden glow across the yard, Keith made a quiet promise to himself: to live, to heal, and to embrace the future with an open heart. The darkness of betrayal had threatened to consume him, but it hadn't. Love, even when fractured, had shown him his strength. And while he didn't know exactly what the future held, Keith knew one thing for certain: he was ready to face it. The autumn sun cast its golden light over the park, where children's laughter mingled with the rustling of leaves. Keith walked along the winding path, his hand securely clasping Cheryl's. Her presence beside him was steady and warm, a stark contrast to the turbulence that had once consumed his life. Maddie and Liam ran ahead, their giggles filling the air as they chased each other around a playground. Keith couldn't help but smile as he watched them, their happiness a reminder of how far they had come as a family. He glanced at Cheryl, who was also smiling, her gaze following the children with quiet affection. "You've made all this look easy," Cheryl said softly, her voice carrying a hint of admiration. Keith chuckled, shaking his head. "It's anything but having you here makes it feel manageable, like I can finally breathe again." Cheryl squeezed his hand, her eyes meeting his. "You've done the hard work, Keith. I'm just lucky to be a part of this." Their connection was unspoken but palpable, a bond forged not through convenience but through trust and patience. Cheryl had entered his life when he needed someone who wouldn't try to fix him but simply stand by him. And in her presence, Keith had discovered not just healing but hope. As they continued walking, a familiar figure caught Keith's eye. Lisa stood by a bench near the playground, her arms crossed as she watched Maddie and Liam with a wistful expression. She looked different, tired, her once bright energy dimmed. Keith's chest tightened momentarily, but it wasn't pain he felt this time. It was something closer to pity. Lisa noticed them and hesitated, her gaze flickering between Keith and Cheryl. Her lips parted as if to speak, but she remained silent, her regret etched into every line of her face. Keith held her gaze for a moment, his expression neutral. There was no anger left, no bitterness, just acceptance. Cheryl sensed the shift and gave his hand another squeeze, grounding him. Keith nodded subtly in Lisa's direction, then turned his attention back to Cheryl. "Let's catch up to the kids," he said, his voice steady. As they walked away, Lisa watched them, her shoulders slumping slightly. She saw the ease in Keith's stride, the way he smiled at Cheryl, the laughter he shared with their children. It was a life she had once been a part of, but had let slip through her fingers. The weight of her choices bore down on her, a constant reminder of what she had lost. For Keith, however, the moment marked a turning point. As he reached the playground and scooped Maddie into his arms, her laughter ringing in his ears, he felt no pull from the past. What was done was done. His focus was on the present, on the people who mattered most. Cheryl joined him, wrapping her arms around Liam as he proudly showed her his latest discovery, a bright red leaf he claimed was the biggest one in the park. They stood together, a picture of quiet joy, a family in the making. Keith looked around, the crisp air filling his lungs. This wasn't the life he had planned, but it was the life he had built, one step at a time. And as he stood there, holding Maddie close and sharing a knowing smile with Cheryl, he realized he wouldn't trade it for anything. The past no longer held him captive. With each step forward, hand in hand with Cheryl, Keith fully embraced the new beginning that awaited him. It wasn't just a fresh start, it was the completion of their journey. After overcoming the challenges with one another, they reached out and helped each other. After overcoming the journey with themselves,